I always say that my job is to be fair and accurate.
Hmm.
It's not to be objective because being objective is impossible. We're all human
Yeah.
beings. We all bring with us to our work our own biases, our experiences, the life forces that have shaped us and shaped our
Hmm.
thinking. And the main job of the reporter, I think, is to really try to see things through the eyes of the people that you're writing about and to try to understand what the conflicts are and to report on them.
Hey, Cheryl,
Hi,
are you in New York?
I'm in DC. I live
Oh,
in
yeah,
DC.
that's right. I always
I'm a
forget you.
Washington correspondent.
Yes, yes, I know. I know. It's all right in front of me on the chat
That's
section.
okay.
I'll get it straight in a minute, but I forget you live in DC too, right?
Yes. Well, I
And
live right
have,
outside DC in Chevy Chase, Maryland.
yeah, I know where you are.
It might as well be DC.
Yeah, and then you work for the Times, but does that ever put you in New York City, or do you just sort of stay where you are?
It puts me a lot of places. In fact, when I covered the White House, it put me all over the world.
Yeah.
So,
And I remember you were there during Obama and
Bush.
Clinton, Bush.
I covered the end of the Bush administration and the beginning of the Obama administration. So for about 5 years, I was a White House correspondent for the Times.
So you got there after Clinton.
I did. I was in DC when Clinton was president, but at that time I was a science writer for the Times in the Times
Yeah.
Washington Bureau.
Well, the fact that you were a White House correspondent for the New York Times at that time gives you a kind of inexhaustible name dropping ability. You've
Yeah,
met everybody and seen everything.
I also
As
covered Congress twice.
yeah, there
So
you are. So you know everyone. And when you and I first talked, you were contacting me to interview me about Dr. Koop, and
I
I forget the
was.
context. Is this for a book you're working
This
on?
is for a book. So this is a book that grows out of really 30 years of my reporting on both public health and politics for the New
Yeah,
York Times and for the LA Times before that. And
yeah.
it looks at the crisis of mistrust in public health and also the conservative backlash against public health. And Coop is a really important part of that story.
And so when you were interviewing me about Dr. Koop, do you have a chapter on him, or were you
I have a
just
I have a chapter that is largely on him.
hmm,
It looks at the Reagan administration and the abortion question. And,
yeah,
Coop, I don't need to tell you, Coop was picked because he was
sure.
anti-abortion
Yeah.
and he really defied the right on abortion. But there was a lot of pressure on the CDC during that era.
It was interesting that you contacted me to interview me, and then we talked a couple times, which gives me this sort of weird impression, haven't you already been on my podcast? But you were interviewing me. So no, wait a
That's
minute, there's
right.
something wrong with this picture. She's asking all the questions. So now I've got to get used to
Now you can
interviewing
ask the
you.
questions.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, it was strange because in the same, more or less the same time frame you contacted me, somebody else contacted me and said, I'm writing a biography of Dr. Koop.
Oh, yes, Nigel Cameron.
Yeah, and then I put you two in touch, I
You
think,
did. You did. And I
and
had
said, "Oh,
known
well, I
him.
know someone who's working on a thing. I'll pass it on."
And you said I know everybody. And in fact, I actually already knew Nigel Cameron from
Okay.
20 years ago when I covered the debate over stem cells and cloning. And he
Yeah,
testified on Capitol Hill, and I dug up an old story that I had written about him.
yeah. So I kind of introduced you, but didn't because you already knew him. But
Yeah,
did you know he was working on that book?
I didn't. And he was very helpful to me.
Oh, well, there you are.
Was
So I did
really
some.
helpful.
I
No,
did
no, you did.
something.
It was great. I really appreciate it. No, I would have not known. And I reached out to him because you mentioned it, and he was
Good,
super helpful.
good. Okay. Well, hey, I should introduce you. I'll start by saying my name is Frank Schaeffer, and this is a podcast called In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. It goes live on YouTube, which we are on right now, and goes to all the other places that podcasts exist. Today, my guest is Sheryl Stolberg, and she is a New York Times correspondent and has been for the better part of the last, 30 years?
almost 27 years. And I'm put in a little plug for my byline. My byline is Sheryl Gay Stolberg. That's my middle name, but no
Yeah.
one calls me Sheryl Gay except maybe my mother sometimes.
Well, I can do that. If I get angry, I'll just
No,
yell, Cheryl Gay, what are you
no,
talking
my
about?
mother always called me Cheryl Gay when she was feeling fond toward me, never when she was angry.
Yeah.
Always in this
A-
sort of sing-song voice.
And we will have Cheryl back at some point in the near future when your book comes out to help you promote it and launch it.
Oh,
When
that
is
would be
that book coming
fabulous.
out? And do you have a title
Well,
yet?
um I don't have a title. I have a title that I'm thinking of that I've knocked
Okay.
around
Well,
with my
and
editor,
publishers
but I
tend to
don't
change these things.
right. So I don't want to say.
No, but anyway, Cheryl got
In
in
terms
touch
of
with me. I
timing, it
don't
might
know.
be a while.
Yeah, a few months ago, Cheryl emailed me and said, I'm writing a book in which I need more information on Dr. C. Everett Koop, that was Ronald Reagan's Surgeon General, who largely became Surgeon General and came to Ronald Reagan's attention because my dad and I and Dr. Koop had made a film series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, which some historians credit as the kind of beginning, if you want to call it that, of the Protestant evangelical involvement in the so-called pro-life movement. So Cheryl and I wound up talking 2 or 3 times and exchanging emails. And then I said to her, you're such an interesting person and you've had such a long, good career with the New York Times. Could I interview you? So that's what we're doing here today. We're not really plugging a book. We're plugging Cheryl.
I'm not accustomed to being on the other end of the interview, but I'll try my best.
But I have a lot I want to ask you about. And this is a luxury for me because usually the morning of a podcast, twice a week or once a week, I am I don't dare turn this camera, by the way, because I'm not tech savvy and we may never get back. But
Okay.
if you could see to the right of me here, there's a stack of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15, 16 books in a pile of the last 16 authors I've interviewed.
Oh, wow.
I've read every single one of these books. And just to show you one here, look how
Oh,
dog-eared
wow.
that
Look at
is.
that.
I really do prepare, and then I read about a third on Kindle, and then I cut and paste. But it means that by the time I get to the interview, I'm trying to hold the book
Mhm.
in my head because I like to prepare properly. And then, of course, so it makes the conversation a little bit less conversational because I'm looking at my notes and I want to say, when on
Mhm.
page 26, where you say this and so forth. And this is a luxury because I'm just talking to someone uh, that I just am interested in as a human being. So, Cheryl, first of all, why don't we just go back and talk about your history with the New York Times, personal or career? I don't care. How does one become a correspondent at the New York Times that then goes and becomes a White House correspondent on top of everything else, which I guess is the plum of journalistic assignments in the United States? I mean, you are as successful as journalists get, isn't that
It's
right?
either the plum or the worst assignment. People have said to me that covering the White House is a job you will be glad you have had because
Yeah,
it's a hard job. But I'll just tell you briefly about my path. I was born in New York. I went to UVA. I worked on my college paper, and I had a couple of newspaper jobs before I landed at the New York Times in 1997. I started at the Providence Journal in Providence, Rhode Island, and I also worked at the Los Angeles Times
yeah.
almost 10 years. And while I was at the LA Times, an editor said to me, do you want to cover medicine? Do you want to be a medical writer? And I said, no, I don't know anything about medicine. And they said, well, that'll it'll be fine. You're good at explaining complicated topics to ordinary people. So I
Mm.
plunged into this world that I knew nothing about, learning terms like myocardial infarction. This was
Yep,
before the internet, so you couldn't type it in to Google and say, what is myocardial infarction? You either had to ask or just pretend. And I
yeah.
looked it up later to just learn that it was a heart attack.
Hmm.
But so I did that, and then my husband and I had a child. We moved to Washington. I moved for the LA Times, but not long thereafter, in 1997, I joined the New York Times as a science writer in the
Hmm.
Washington Bureau. And I covered the FDA and NIH. I wrote a lot about AIDS.
Did the New
And
York Times reach out to you, or did you go and say, I'd like to work for you guys?
well, it was kind of a funny story. The incoming when I was in Washington for the Los Angeles Times, I reconnected with an editor with whom I had worked at the Providence Journal. She was on the Washington desk of the New York Times, and she was about to become a science editor of the
Mm.
science editor of the New York Times. And she took me to lunch and I said, well, if you ever need a medical writer, let me know. It was very offhand. And she said, send me your clips, send me some stuff. So I
Yeah.
sent her a few stories and she wrote back and said, well, send me some more. And, before I knew it, I was being interviewed for a job. The New York office called and said, we're calling to schedule your interview. And I said, for
Mhm.
what? And so I was very lucky. And
That's great. And what year was that?
that was 1997.
Okay.
So it's been 27 years. Wow, 27 years.
Yeah. And then, so now you're a science writer working for the
No,
science editor, or how do you start at the Times?
well, I was a science correspondent based in Washington. I worked for the science editors in New York. I covered the FDA and NIH, and I wrote about cloning and stem cell research and
Hmm.
bioethics. And a few years after that, in the early 2000s, I felt a little restless. And one of the great things about the New York Times is they let you reinvent yourself and kind of lots of different jobs. And I wanted to do something that was more of Washington. I felt like I'm in Washington. I want to be of
Yeah,
Washington. So I asked to cover Congress, and they let me cover Congress.
that's great.
And, I went up there, I had no idea what I was
Now,
doing.
when you start covering Congress, and this is a new gig for you within the Times, are you assigned to someone who's already there, or who's been doing it for a while, or did they just throw you into the deep end and say, okay, it's all yours now?
Well, there's a team. So there were three of us, and there
Yeah.
was a senior, congressional correspondent, my colleague Carl Hulse, who still works for the Times. So you're not really thrown in completely alone because we're
Hmm.
a big news operation and there's a lot to cover. But it's a pretty fast learning
Yeah.
curve to be in this. Congress it really is like a microcosm of America. I mean, it's all these people from all over the country
Hmm.
thrown together. And unlike the White House, where things are very controlled, Congress is very chaotic and you can catch people on the fly, lawmakers
Yeah.
to talk to them. And there's always, 10 things happening at any given time. So it's lively and it's chaotic and you got to be on your feet.
Would a day involve, what are you doing on a day? Are you going wandering the halls of Congress? Hey, Congressman, asking questions? Are you scheduling interviews? Are you home writing and researching? How
Uh,
did you, what's a typical
I
day
am
for New
not,
York Times?
that's the one thing you're not doing when you're covering Congress. You are not at home. You
Yeah.
have to
So where are
be.
you doing your actual writing? Just
So,
start with that.
so the Times, like most news organizations, has a little area, a little space in the Senate Press Gallery. The Senate
Yeah.
Press Gallery is on the third floor of the Capitol, and
Hmm.
it's a stretch of space that overlooks the Senate chamber. And there's lots and lots of desks there. And we had, a few desks, and that's where I would work in this kind of cramped little space because
Yeah.
real estate is at a premium in the Capitol.
Yeah.
And, that's where I would write. And, you're right. A lot of times when you cover Congress, you're trying to run people down to talk to them.
Yeah.
Sometimes you might be covering a vote. For instance, here's, a Supreme Court confirmation. I loved covering Supreme Court
Hmm.
confirmations. That's a very kind of formal vote, or at least it
Sure.
was. I was covering Congress and all the senators take their seats and you're in the chamber in the gallery overlooking the chamber and you're watching the body language and then you're writing your story and probably grabbing people afterwards to talk to them. So that's
When you write a story at that level, because you're not as senior as you are now, at that point in your life, how much intervention is there in what you've written? As you know, since I'm a writer myself and I deal with editors and people, I'm very aware of that process. Okay, so you're writing something and then it goes somewhere. Does it come back to you marked up, or did they just do their thing with it
um
at
well
that
at
point,
that
not
point,
now?
even at that point, like if you're in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times covering Congress, you know how to write a story that does
Yeah,
not require ripping up and rewriting because the newspaper business just moves too quickly.
sure.
You can't be on a daily assignment and need, a lot of heavy editing. So
Hmm.
back in those days, I used to write on Microsoft Word and then send it in, I think by email, if I'm remembering correctly.
Sure.
And then they would edit it and they'd send back what we call in the business a playback, which is the
Yeah.
edited copy with their changes. And then you talk to your editor, and then, somebody loads it into the editing system that we used at the time, and it gets published. And it's
Do you
different
find
now.
when it comes back to you, the headline they've attached to something you cooked up, or they've done it and then you're saying that is not what my story's about?
Oh, that has changed over time. And
Hmm.
what we have now is a very interactive tool that the Times developed where I can be writing a story, another reporter can be in the story, and we can be co-writing it.
Yeah.
A picture editor can be dropping pictures in, my editor can be back reading it. So it's a kind of this very transparent system. And over the years, it used to be that the editors wrote the headlines, and sometimes you would go, "Oh my God, I can't believe that headline."
Yeah.
Um, like I'll tell you one story. When I covered Jenna Bush's wedding, I wrote about Jenna Bush's wedding for the style pages of the New York Times. Here she is, the
Yeah.
president's daughter. And it was happening in Crawford, which is a beautiful ranch. The Bush
Mm.
Ranch in Crawford is absolutely lovely. And I wrote this story about the wedding, and the Upper West Side New York editors of the New York Times style section put on the headline was "The Hoedown in Crawford."
Oh, wow.
And I thought, oh my
It was
God,
not a hoedown.
I can't believe this.
Yeah.
It was so embarrassing. But these days, reporters actually suggest their own headlines, and it's a more collaborative process. So
Yeah.
I don't think that ever would have happened.
Today you'd have a little more of a say.
Well, because we can see, I can see it. I mean, in the years past, we didn't have that system, so you'd send
Yeah.
your story in, and somebody'd write a headline, and you'd see what the headline said, the next day, or maybe they'd consult, but you know.
Yeah. Okay, so you're covering Congress, and this is sort of toward the beginning of that relationship. And then what is the next step? Who's president at that point?
Bush was
Bush is
president.
president.
Bush was president. Trent Lott had just been knocked out of being majority leader because
Mhm.
you might remember he made these very impolitic, racially
I
tinged
remember.
comments at Strom Thurmond's 100th birthday party.
Yeah.
In fact, one of my first stories for the Times in covering Congress was a story about Strom Thurmond turning 100. It wasn't covering that party, but anyway, so
Did you
Trent
mention
Lott,
he had been in the Ku Klux Klan in his younger
I,
days?
I think I did, yes.
Yeah. As
Which,
one does, as one does.
right. So, well, why am I blanking on his name? Robert Byrd from West Virginia, but he repented, but he
Yeah,
had,
well, he said he did.
yeah. But in
Yeah.
any event, so Bill Frist had just become majority leader. It was 2002.
Yeah.
It was, in between 9/11 and our going to war in Iraq. So I wound
Yeah.
up covering Congress during that. It was a really consequential time when Congress took a vote to go to war
Yeah, no kidding.
in Iraq,
Yeah,
and
you were not writing on minor subjects at that point.
no, the Patriot Act, rights, civil liberties and versus.
At that point in your life, just to go in a slightly different direction, you're
Mhm.
you're in Congress, and I'll set this up in a weird way. My son was a Marine and he fought in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I know the Bush family personally and had notes from everybody, including Laura and all the rest. My son is going to get killed potentially. He didn't die in a war started by a man who I did not like personally, and also did not agree with politically. And yet, I'm a loyal American and I back my son's service. I'm just wondering, as a reporter trying to report facts, and I'm not trying to discuss whether you're liberal or conservative or whatever, but how did you find reporting on a war where you must have had some sort of personal opinion about it in terms of, is this even a good idea? And now you're writing a kind of a
Yeah.
bloodless story because it's supposed to be objective, but at the same, and I set that in the context of my own personal feelings of having a
Mhm.
son serving in a war I didn't agree with, to which I was connected on the most visceral level, but with a family that I knew from my past because of my evangelical background in the Republican Party. It was a very, very stressful, weird time for
Yeah.
me and for my wife on many fronts. But I'm wondering how you felt,
Mhm.
just as an American citizen, What was your opinion of that conflict when we went in? Where was your head at? Is this something you thought we needed to do and you're trying to cover it objectively? How did you feel about it?
So I feel actually a little awkward saying, what my own opinion was, even though it's, 20
A
years.
long time ago.
But I'll share with you that this is what reporters go through with every story they
Hmm.
cover, large or small, right? I always say that my job is to be fair and accurate.
Mm.
It's not to be objective because being objective is impossible. We're all human
Yeah.
beings. We all bring with us to our work our own biases, our experiences, the life forces that have shaped us and shaped our
Mm.
thinking. And the main job of the reporter, I think, is to really try to see things through the eyes of the people that you're writing about and to try to understand what the conflicts are and to report on them. So, I've had people ask me these questions over the years. I live in Chevy Chase, Maryland. It's a very liberal area.
Sure.
And I remember when I started covering the White House, the Bush White House, neighbors came up to me and said, what are you going to do about your job? Like, how can you do that? How can you stand to be in the same room with him?
Hmm.
And my answer to that was, this is the President of the United States. I have a responsibility as a journalist to inform people about what's going on in our government, about what our leaders are
Mm.
doing. I'm writing about their decision making, and I'm trying to shed light on what they bring to bear in their
Hmm.
own decisions and how I feel about a particular leader or member of Congress um, or issue is kind of irrelevant. It needs to
Yeah.
be irrelevant to my job. So there's not to say that I don't have feelings or opinions, although my kids, who are very activist, have often accused me of not having opinions,
We're
you
not
know,
having enough of a slant.
not having, right. But, I've been a journalist a long time, 40
Would you
years.
say your kids, how old are they now?
They are 26 and 29.
And as we speak, what are they up to?
As we speak, the older one is the analytics director for a group called America Votes, which
Mhm.
is a progressive group that tries to coordinate super PAC spending to elect progressive candidates.
Yeah.
And the younger one is a paralegal at an employment law firm and is interested in public interest law. And just yesterday knocked it out of the park on the LSAT. So I'm very happy to report. Got a
Oh, that's
great
great.
score and is going to apply to law school. But so both my children, I think, have a strong social justice streak. They've grown up around Washington, around
Hmm.
protests, in a kind of a political climate. I think that, that seeps in.
Did you find when you were going to the next step after your congressional reporting that you went into it with more confidence because you had sort of, cut your teeth on the House, and then the next step once you got into the White House, were you glad you started in the House
It
instead of right
was.
into the White House? Just talk about that transition a little bit.
Um, yeah, I was very glad that I covered Congress because first of all, I think you need to cover Congress to understand how Washington really works.
Sure.
So much happens there. And it was also just a good kind of a good training ground
Hmm.
for reporting on an elected official. And of course, when you're covering the White House, you're reporting pretty much on one
Sure.
elected official. I'm trying to remember. It was 2006 when I started covering the Bush White House. I do remember one very funny episode, which speaks to my ignorance of the kind of ways of the Washington Press Corps. We were at a press conference in the Rose Garden, and President Bush called on me. I was very new White House correspondent. It might have been my first or second press conference.
Yeah.
And I stood up, and the proper greeting is when the president calls on you is thank you, Mr. President.
Hmm.
But I said, and bear in mind, Bush hated the New York Times. He was very mad at the New York Times. We had broken the story about his secret surveillance program, and he was not happy with us at all. But he called on me, and I just said, instead of "Thank you, Mr. President," I said, "Hi, Mr. President." And he said, "Did you say hi, Mr. President?" And I said, "Yes, I did." I said, it was awkward, and I said, "Well, I thought it was a friendly greeting." And he said, no, he said, "I thought it was a friendly greeting." And I said, "Well, we're a friendly newspaper," which of course
He
was not
doesn't think.
really,
Yeah, that's
there was a
great.
lot of tension between the Bush White House and the New York Times
I
at the
mean,
time.
hey, all through the whole thing.
Right.
Um,
And so everyone laughed and that little clip played on Fox News and we sort of went on. But I actually think that that incident sort of reveals something in a
hmm,
way, which is that, which maybe has gone from Washington now, which is that there can be tensions between institutions.
yeah,
There was real tension between the Bush White House and the Times. There were times when the Bush White House did not like what I wrote. There were times when the Obama White House did not like what I wrote, and they would let you know. But it wasn't personal, and it was a professional, you know, engagement and disagreement. It
yeah.
wasn't
That brings me to a question.
nasty like you're seeing now with name
Yeah.
calling and insults and all of
Well, and
that.
then attacks on the press in general.
Right, right.
As that
Yes,
Trump specialized in.
whatever tension there was,
Hmm.
the White House clearly, and I believe President Bush believed in the importance of a free press.
Yeah, oh yeah, no question about it. And the old school Republicans that I grew up knowing when I was in the religious right were never, you would never have mistaken them for anybody in the MAGA right today in the Trump,
Yeah.
era. This is completely off the chart. There was nothing even approaching that, even with the quote most conservative people that you knew. Let me ask you a question, and we'll get back to talking about your career. But I'm just really interested in your opinion, and I hope you don't say, "Well, as a journalist, I can't tell you because I'm supposed to be whatever." I think you can get. I think you can do this one. I'm
Okay.
guessing I'm going to frame it in a way that you can. What do people who have not been New York Times reporters in the White House and in Congress, and who do not live effectively in Washington, D.C., as you have now for many years, what do we all out here get wrong about Washington in our cynicism about all parties, or in our views of the right and left, or in our pro Trump enthusiasm, or in our Democratic Party liberalism, cookie cutter, knee jerk reactions? It must seem to you that your average American voter, even who considers herself, say, well informed, gets a lot wrong in the nuances, in the little things, or in the big ones. I really want you to go there
Hmm.
because I think that you bring an absolutely unique perspective there
I
that
think
people really ought to listen to. What do we get wrong? What's it really like, as opposed to our caricature of right, left, liberal, Democrat, blah blah blah.
I think one thing that people get wrong or don't think about is that there are a lot of people in Washington who are really dedicated to making the world a better place. Like there are
Mm-hmm.
people who work in Washington who could be making a lot more money in the private sector. They are maybe unnamed, not low-level bureaucrats or maybe low-level ones, but also pretty high-level ones who aren't
Yeah.
cabinet secretaries or um, you know, generals or what have you, who are really kind of making the town run, making the government run, and
Mm.
trying to do right by the taxpayers. And people don't realize that about Washington. They kind of, talk about, Trump talked about the deep state.
Mm.
Well, the deep state are the people who are making sure that, you know, people get their Social Security payments or their Medicare
Mm.
coverage, and or that people like your son are, looked after when they're in the military. And
Yeah.
there's a whole apparatus of Washington that is the non-elected part of Washington. And what I
Mm.
think of it as kind of like the permanent culture. And so when someone like Trump comes in and says he wants to drain the swamp or they want to blow up Washington, I
Hmm.
think people out in the rest of the country don't realize what that sounds like to the ordinary people who live and work here and who may have differences of opinion,
Hmm.
strong differences of
Hmm.
opinion, but who are genuinely motivated by what they think is the right thing to do. I'm not saying everybody
Yeah.
is genuinely motivated. I don't want to be a Pollyanna. There are some people who are in it to line their pockets and to gain power and influence or um but there are a lot of people who are truly motivated
Hmm.
um by their vision for what they think will make
Hmm.
the world a better place. And I think that's what folks
Don't
don't
get.
get. I do think Washington has changed, though. If you had asked me this question like 20 years ago, I might have said, well, people don't get that, the same people that you're fighting with, you're on the sidelines of your kid's soccer game together,
Yeah.
like a Republican and a Democrat, and then, they're together, having a drink or a dinner or whatever. I do think that's changed. I think that as our political culture has changed and grown nastier, that kind of, that old Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill getting a beer at the end of the day, that's been gone for a long time.
Yeah.
And I don't see that coming back, sadly. And that kind of speaks to in a way, Joe Biden's um not dilemma, but his situation now. I mean,
Yeah. Well, he's certainly out of that
he's
old
of
school.
another Washington. My colleague
Yeah.
Peter Baker wrote a great story about that in today's
Yeah.
paper.
Oh, who did?
My colleague Peter Baker, our
Yeah,
chief
I
White
didn't
House
see that story.
correspondent, wrote a terrific
What's the
story.
headline if you remember?
Can't remember the headline, but it was basically a story about how Biden is kind of this old school Washington Paul
Sure. Yeah.
trying to adjust to a very new style of politics.
Yeah, to put it mildly, a new
Yeah.
style. I mean, of all the luck, of all the gin joints, I mean, of all the luck of the draw, of all the hands you could be dealt, can you imagine, coming out of the old school and you wind up at the end of your life running against Donald Trump? It's just unthinkable.
Yeah.
You know, it's like being cast in a movie and you think you're getting the lead in an ordinary film, and it turns out to be a sort of a snuff film porn movie. I mean, I feel so sorry for Joe Biden. Seriously, just man to man, just imagine, being stuck in that. I have a kind of a follow up to that question
Mhm.
in terms of the same sort of what do we not understand about the media. I can remember going on the Today Show with Jane Pauley back in, I don't know whether it was the 80s, I think, when she was the host, arguing the position that the New York Times liberal bias was showing, in that we knew for a fact that my dad's book, A Christian Manifesto, that called, by the way, for the violent overthrow of the US government unless we reverse Roe v. Wade, was outselling whatever the book was that happened to be the top.
So,
And let's take it for the sake of the argument that I was correct. Um, I know this opens a whole can of worms, but it has to do with you calling me about Dr. Koop. So I don't think I'm sandbagging you here. But back when I was in the evangelical subculture and we were fighting to be heard, we were always very much the outsiders. So Newsweek did an article on my dad. It was a very big deal because, someone's finally paying attention to us. But we were very much of the middle. So when we opened our seminar in Dallas, we had the Dallas Cowboys coach Roger Staubach there. One of the Bush family was there, and so forth. And yet you could read the New York Times for a year and you would never know that there was this massive movement about to percolate up to the surface and actually take over the US government and finally the
mhm.
Supreme Court. I guess when the Tea Party came along, there were people who started asking questions like, who are these people? But all the reporting was about the Rust Belt, people out of work.
Yeah, I might take a little issue with that.
Yeah.
Because well, first of all, I just in my book research, I mean, I actually came across what I'm pretty sure, I'll double check, was a front page story about your father and Coop traveling the country to 20 cities
In the Times.
to promote the film in the Times. Um, and it must have run in 1979 or maybe 80 during the campaign.
Oh, good. Well, hey,
And
either I missed that one or I didn't want to include it because I was
so
part of the other side. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to, I can type on my computer here and look it up, but
I
I'll send
believe
it to you
you.
later. I'm pretty sure it was a front page story. I'll let you know. And
Mhm.
then I remember in the Tea Party, well, maybe we missed the Tea Party. The Tea Party, I think, really kind of had its seeds in a backlash against the 2003 Medicare Part D bill that George
Yeah,
Bush pushed through, which I covered. I was there and like, 3 in the morning when
sure.
Tom DeLay was twisting arms to get that bill through. And I think we didn't really notice it until around 2009 when Obama became president and um, he proposed Obamacare. And that summer, I do remember going to events that summer of 2009, these
Hmm.
sort of anti-Obamacare events
Yeah.
that were the seeds of the Tea Party. But I think, are you asking me like, did we miss, have we missed
No,
these?
I'm asking you a question related to the one I asked about what are we out here not understanding about Washington from someone
Mhm.
who, yeah, you're not a Washington insider, you're a journalist reporting on the
Yeah.
insiders, but you've seen them up close. Um, and I'm asking you uh, a question about for someone who's had a long career at the New York Times, which is the sort of mothership of all journalism in America,
Mhm.
or has been. It's really interesting to me that because I've been on both sides of this issue, having been a sidekick, a nepotistic sidekick to my evangelist activist father, part of the whiny right wing, they don't pay attention to us, they don't respect us. We kind of laid the groundwork for that on the abortion issue.
Mhm.
And now, fast forward, that's all MAGA is about. But I'm asking you, as someone who's been there throughout, to give me some sort of fact-based analysis of whether elite journalism, quote unquote, because you hear this word elites all the time, um, Ivy League, New York Times, blah, 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 whether they get this movement now, and did they miss the boat at some point, when we saw Hillary lose and all of a sudden the dial went to Trump. And I had been talking about evangelical involvement in the campaign. I mean, you always see your own issues more clearly than maybe other people do, but it was my opinion that the analysis by the media, I'm not talking in specifics about the Times, kind of missed the boat on the radical nature of the movement that my dad and I helped unleash and where it was all going. And I don't know, do you want to come up with a counter to that, or have I got that wrong, or what's the real inside view of your
Oh, I
as a careerist New York Times reporter?
um I think we definitely missed the boat on Trump's election. I mean, I think there's just no question about
Yeah,
that. If you looked at the famous New York Times needle, it was
I,
pointing to Hillary, 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 and then all of a sudden on election night it went woo, over to
yeah,
Trump. So, and maybe in retrospect, the retrospectoscope is a wonderful tool. I mean, we may have missed that line of from your dad and Coop and Reagan and the evangelical embrace of abortion as an issue, going all the way through
yeah.
to Trump. And in fact, we talked earlier about Nigel Cameron. He said to me, I may be scooping myself here, but he said to me he sees a direct line between Coop and Trump, which I thought was very interesting.
Nigel Cameron, the guy we know,
The guy we know, the biographer of
yeah,
The biographer of C. Everett Koop.
yeah, whose book is
Um,
coming out.
right. So I do think I think we certainly got it now. I mean, I
Yeah, I
think
would imagine we,
the 2016 election was such a huge wake-up call.
yeah.
I will say, I'm gonna just pat myself on the back here a little bit. I actually won a bet when Donald Trump won the presidency.
Who
And
did you bet with, if I can ask?
I bet just a neighbor, it was just $1. And I didn't bet that Trump would win. My neighbor said, no way, he can't win. It's not
Yeah,
possible. I said, I'm not saying Trump will win, but he can win.
yeah,
And we would go back and forth. And the reason I knew that was my own kind of on the ground reporting in a
yeah.
few
You've been
key
out there.
states,
Hmm.
in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in West Virginia, in trying to remember where else, but in the several key states, just talking to people on the ground,
Yeah.
I could tell that there were people who you might not think would be Trump voters who were going to vote for him.
Yeah.
And I do think we missed that. We pay too much attention to the polls, and I think, the only poll that matters is the one that happens on election day.
Yeah, let me reintroduce you a second here.
Sorry.
You are listening to and or watching In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I am Frank Schaeffer. I am a writer, an author, a commentator. My guest is Sheryl Gay Stolberg, and she is can I call you a senior correspondent or reporter? I
I'm
mean,
a Washington correspondent for the New
yeah,
York.
you're a big deal. This is a big
Ah,
deal. When you vilify the New York Times, have a face to go with this. Now
thank you.
you were speaking badly of Cheryl, and she's a nice person, and she interviewed me on Dr. Coop. So
Well, it's
stop vilifying the New York Times. So
okay. I
anyway,
can take it.
Cheryl is a New York Times Washington correspondent and Wilson Center Public Policy Fellow. And she writes about the intersection of health and policy and politics. She's been a White House correspondent. She has been in the House covering everything. She bet a neighbor $1 that Trump could win last time, and I'm going to have to ask you if I just don't even want to know
Boy.
if Trump could win again. Please hold some hope out for us. Anyway, if you could subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer at Apple Podcasts, we can keep doing this. And to my Substack, it has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com, where I have my commentary. It has to be said. And by the way, a book club, when your book comes out, called It Has to Be Read, that is doing very well. We're doing wonderful books. We have a book by Krista Brown called Baptist Land. You know, she's the one that broke the story about how the Southern Baptists didn't follow through on
Mhm.
throwing people out, and the power of giving away power by Barzan, who was the ambassador to the UK for Obama, and who's a friend of mine, and whose book I love. Brad Wilcox Get Married, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm looking at the books we've just done, and hopefully your book will be on that pile sometime.
I hope so.
So let me ask you a follow-up here in terms of just your looking at what's happening now. Let's take it as read the New York Times now understands there's a religious right. I'm being facetious, and is doing something about it. And let's take it as read that they understand that there is a direct line from what we were doing in the 70s and 80s to Roe v. Wade going down in Dobbs, because that's a direct line with that movement. What do you, as someone who knows what's going on, predict will happen? There's just this article now, I think in the Times, or maybe I was reading in the Washington Post today, I forget which newspaper, about the fact that now the polls are starting to shift on gay marriage, and this is now being targeted by the same group of people. You know, it seems unthinkable that could be reversed, but so did Roe v. Wade 10 years ago. We never thought it would be. We never thought we could, quote, win that. And now it has. Just as an American citizen who's got her ear to the ground as a reporter, and I'm not asking for your politics, how far can this go in terms of this revolution against everything that we all think was solid
Mhm.
in terms of settled policy on liberal democracy, human rights, and so forth? I don't have an answer to that. I'm asking you really honestly from your heart what you think about this.
Well, if you look at Justice Thomas's dissent in the Dobbs case,
Yeah,
he raised two other cases. One was Griswold, which was the case that established a right to contraception,
yeah,
and the other was the same-sex marriage case from the plaintiff's name is escaping me at the moment. I
yeah,
can picture his face. As saying that, that the rationale that was applied in Dobbs, that, the Supreme Court went too far in interpreting this right to privacy in the Constitution, could
yeah.
also be applied to those cases. So you can see that on the very far right, there's now a legal framework for
Hmm.
that kind of thinking. And that is the beginning, right? I mean, that's, these battles were not won overnight, the
Yeah,
battle to overturn Roe. So I think you can never say never. I mean, we
yeah,
don't we don't know what's going to happen. I do want to just defend the New York Times a little bit, it's clear that we recognized the religious right during the Reagan era, during the Bush era. I mean, George W. Bush, you know, won on kind of the three-legged stool of, you know, the religious conservatives, economic, you know, sort of conservatives, social conservatives. Um, so it's not like we missed the boat, but I think that if we learned anything from Dobbs, it
Hmm.
has to be that we need not to shut our eyes at what the possibilities are. And if you look at some of the really the very far right anti-abortion groups, they also oppose birth control, certain forms of
Sure.
birth control.
Yeah.
You know, IUDs, which they believe interfere with the implantation of a fertilized embryo, which the
Sure.
FDA says that's not the case. So, is it going to happen? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball.
Yeah.
But could it happen? Clearly, there are some people who have that goal in their sights.
Speaking as someone who's lived her life as a reporter, um, it seems to me that, the attacks on the First Amendment and the press in general from Trump and also the far right across the world, Hindu nationalism, Hungary, it doesn't matter where you look, and obviously Vladimir Putin, who's killing and journalists and throwing them in jail. I think this, I'm not saying it's a bad time to be a journalist, but it's certainly, um, it seems to me that, liberal democracy is being attacked on a lot of fronts. And one of them is press freedom in the media. And I just wonder from your point of view,
Yeah.
this is your field of work, and it's people are trying to shut it down and destroy it.
Yeah, I worry about that. I worry a lot
Yeah.
about that. And not just because people are trying to shut it down and destroy it, but also just the economic model, especially for newspapers. So
Yeah.
we're already in a situation where a lot of small newspapers and even medium-sized ones are struggling.
Yeah.
And I do worry about a president, a leader who, you know, tries to turn the press into the enemy of the
Yeah.
people. I mean, we saw what happened not too far from here in Annapolis a few years ago at the newspaper there when someone came in and gunned down a bunch of reporters.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, our we have to be more careful about our security, our personal security,
Yeah.
in this environment, just like a lot of elected officials do.
Yeah.
And you know, I think it's frightening.
A related question that Ernie, my producer, just put in my notes section, which I find very interesting, is to talk a little bit about the way research into partisanship is affecting public health, because you've been
That's
covering
my
public
book.
health, and of course that's your
Yes.
book. But we're thinking of the COVID pandemic and so forth, along with fact-based reporting on all things, and therefore the media being attacked as fake news, which, by the way, was something we in evangelicals developed completely right from our mother's knee. The Bible was the truth, biology was fake news,
Hmm.
evolution was fake news. So that way of thinking is already ingrained
Yeah.
in the conservative religious circles. So Trump just, that he kind of successfully borrowed that. But nowhere has that been had more of an impact on people's lives, literally life and death issues, than say the anti-vaccination movement or the science being the enemy when it comes to the environment. People
Right.
just so how has that affected your work?
So that is actually what my book is about. It's about how public health was kind of engulfed by the culture wars. How
Yeah.
did public health, which has always been political, and biomedical science supported by the government are political because they rely on government funding. But how
Yeah.
did they become partisan, a victim of partisan politics? And you know, it's interesting. I was interviewing just earlier today one of the leading AIDS activists, a guy who's a very, very prominent founder of ACT UP, and we were talking about trust. And the back in those days when the AIDS advocacy movement was starting up, and there was a lot of anger toward the government, toward Tony Fauci. They were calling him a murderer,
Sure.
towards, you know, the FDA. And But he said something really interesting to me. He said, we were never about tearing it down. We were
Mm,
about building it up. And I thought that was really interesting that he was saying that our demonstrations, meaning the AIDS activists, were for science. They wanted more
mm.
science.
More
They
science.
didn't
Yeah.
lack faith in institutions. They just wanted more from their government. Whereas what we're seeing now is really all about tearing down institutions.
Yeah.
And I think that, that is the big switch. And it is affecting people's health. We know that people in red states and states that voted for Donald Trump or counties that voted for Trump had higher death rates from COVID
Sure.
than states that voted for Biden. And that is nuts for your political beliefs to be, basically informing your health decisions.
Mm.
But that's where we are.
Well,
And
I
it's
come
not
from an
healthy for
evangelical,
America.
but yeah, I come from a background where science itself was seen as a
Yes.
philosophical existential threat to our way of being. And this is now translated into anti-vaccine and all the rest. But there's an added thing. In my day, quote unquote, we didn't have the people were not looking at, TikTok for their medical information and sharing, algorithmically
Yes.
groomed opinion on Facebook. So you were old enough to have been around when, you got your information from the same newscasts and newspapers, and
Right.
now it just seems on top of the hysterical, mythology that's now being proposed as opposed to science. Your book has got to deal with the fact that this is exponentially exploded into the public mind because, to quote my producer Ernie, we are the media now, not you. You're at a newspaper.
Yeah.
You're not the media. I am because I'm doing this thing and can say anything I want. And if it strikes a chord with somebody and hits the right algorithmic formula, there's a million people watching in 10 seconds. It's a
Yeah,
weird,
and that's a big
weird
difference.
thing. How does that all translate into what you're trying to do, which is basically keep me safe by explaining why I should be getting my vaccinations?
Well, so that's a huge issue, and that is a reason. That's a driver for the partisanship and the culture wars that we're seeing around public health, which is that it's
Yeah.
been magnified on the internet. The same activist that I was talking to earlier today said to me, he said, if we tried to do ACT UP today, I don't think we could do it because Fox News would brand us a terrorist group,
Mm.
and there'd be all these, social media posts, and the cooperation that they eventually managed to get with federal officials like Fauci would never have happened.
Yeah.
So, we're operating in this environment where you're right. There's, there is no media. Everybody's in the media.
Yeah.
And you know, that's like a whole nother problem that you
But
and
how
I
does that strike you?
oh,
Because, maybe it's because I'm 72 years old, but I miss the gatekeepers. I've even
oh,
seen the fact that gatekeepers have gone away. This is not a digression because I'm going to talk for 1 second and then get back to you on this, has affected me as a writer in that editors aren't editors anymore. In publishing houses, they ask me what my media footprint is, how many people follow me on Facebook before they send me any corrections on a manuscript, because the whole thing is basically now skewed toward your public presence, not have I written a good book. And the mentality of the younger editors has really shifted.
that's interesting. I have an older editor, I'm happy to
Good, stick
report.
with him or her.
She's a legendary editor. She's at Random House, and I'm very
Yeah, well,
lucky to
there you
have
go.
her.
But when she goes
Yeah.
away, it'll be interesting to see who's
Yes.
replacing her.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
she wasn't raised doing this. She'd actually read books.
Yeah. And it's interesting. You're making me think back to when I first covered the Obama White House, and
Mm-hmm.
I was complaining to Dan Pfeiffer, who now has his own podcast and his own media empire. I was complaining to him, I think that the president hadn't done any interviews with us.
Mm.
And I remember him saying to me something like, we've got a million ways to get our message out.
Yeah,
And that was like in the dawn of Twitter, right? 2009.
sure.
But even then, they could see that there were other ways beyond
Yep,
the mainstream, the staid old gray lady, New York Times.
yeah,
They had other ways to get their message out. And now everybody has other ways
yeah.
to get their message out. And the message is it's very difficult for a leader. Obama used to lament that he was not governing in the era of like FDR, when FDR could have a fireside chat,
Sure.
could just speak to Americans, that he was governing in this cacophonous media environment. And,
Yeah.
he had come in trying to, vowing he was going to bring the country together, and, he wasn't able to do it.
Does the kind of clickbait mentality, and again, I like the New York Times. Can I just go on the record? I complain about it. I say this, I say that. It's you're lucky to be part of an institution that's sort of like, so much a thing that it's just, knee jerk. Of course, the liberal media, then we think that,
Mhm.
but it's good. The world's better off because of the New York Times. So, but I've noticed something weird in my own life. Back in the day when somebody like Terry Gross interviewed me for my memoir, Crazy for God, you could see a bump in sales numbers, or if you were, on the Today Show, something, your publisher would tell you, because in those days that's pre Amazon even, they would tell you 3 weeks later, oh, your hard copy sales just went up or something. I sometimes Ernie will put something up on TikTok, and I've had things go to 3 and 4 million views. Not this interview, but short little things, picking flowers for my wife, or a little commentary on Donald Trump will be this or
Mhm.
whatever. Until say Facebook changes the algorithm, and now they punish you for a month because some word got picked out in what you said. But anyway, the point of my story is there's no bounce. So whatever this is doesn't
Mhm.
actually have any effect on me as a writer. So it's like if I say I'm the author of fill in the blank my new book, and that particular thing, me walking my dog, gets 1 million hits, nothing changes on Amazon. So the old gatekeepers were part of a real universe that as
Yeah.
a writer you could actually see that, things change, things happen because you were in the New York Times or something. The new media, I don't know what it's having a big effect on us in terms of conspiracy theories and shit, clickbait, but it's having no effect on the level of discourse that actually breeds the sort of ideas that in the old days changed things. I don't understand it, what's happened. And
Well,
I'm part of it, and I don't get it.
um, I think what you say is true. I mean, it is harder for journalists and for anyone really to affect change in this environment because there are
Hmm.
so many competing voices out there. I think I still maybe have a naive belief that, what we do is important and can bring about change, and we can expose wrongdoing. And I'm thinking, for instance, of the New York Times coverage of George Santos.
Yeah,
We were the ones who broke that story about
yeah,
him, being a liar.
yeah,
And that story, had legs. It had consequences.
yeah,
Um, so it's not like we're completely powerless, but I do think that it is harder to get a national conversation going
yeah. And
than
also the
right now.
compartmentalization hadn't happened back in the day.
Right.
So people were not mainlining information that they only agreed with. You read things you didn't
Right.
agree with, and you had to think about it. And these days, you don't have to see anything you don't agree with. You go to your
Right.
you go to your thing.
But I think we're not going back, so we kind of have to live and figure out a way to survive in the environment
Yeah.
that we
One of the
have.
things I try to do with this podcast is I talk to people like Jerry Baker, who was the editor of the Times, the Financial Times, and then came and was the editor at the Wall Street Journal for a while. Who ideologically I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but I had a good conversation for an hour.
Hmm.
Part of which, he gave me some critiques of the New York Times, of course, as a kind of another thing. But again, he was sort of an old school, older person who knew that my podcast is not from his point of view, and yet he was willing to talk to me, and I wanted to talk to him.
Well, I think that's so important,
Yeah,
honestly. I mean, that's frankly what is missing, right? Is that
what's missing?
people, I mean, it's what you asked me before. What do people not get about Washington? And I said, years ago, I would have said that what they don't get is that people actually talk to each other, that they're civil, that, that's what's missing from Washington.
Yeah,
right now is
Yeah.
that, people are not talking to each other from opposing points of view. Instead, you have people making, ad hominem attacks on
Yeah.
the physical appearance of another member of Congress. And,
Yes.
um, it's, I always
So,
think like, would you want your children to behave this way?
yeah, exactly. So let me ask you just sort of ask you a couple questions here because they sort of relate. What is the role of legacy media in an age of information overload? I mean, how do you function? And secondly, let's talk about Donald Trump because the information overload and the alternative media, starting with Fox News and then going to all this craziness,
Mhm.
including Elon Musk now having turned Twitter into God knows what. Um, tech bro involvement in billions to skew things so they don't have any regulation. I don't know where any of this is going, but how do you see this? In other words, you're in legacy media, the elite, blah, blah, blah. Trump is on the horizon again. And even if he's not reelected, God knows what happens the next morning if the result isn't accepted. I mean, we're really in deep water here. Part of that, and your job is to help the rest of us out here navigate that and
Yeah.
come to some sort of informed opinion. So, of all the times to be a reporter, I mean,
I
you're really
think
in a hot seat.
I mean, honestly, I think the job of the legacy media is to do what we've always done, but just do it in a different platform. So it's always been our job to expose wrongdoing, to hold accountable elected officials, to shed light on problems, um, to educate the public.
Yeah,
And that is the role of the free press in a democratic society, and
yeah,
that is still our role, and that's our mission. It's to tell the truth, to shed light, and we are doing that. And I have to say, I'm actually very proud of the way the New York Times has transitioned into
mm,
this new age, because if you look at our website, first of all, we have 20 million unique visitors. We have a big reach, and
yes, yes,
it's very engaging. And we've got platforms that are engaging for young people. My colleague Michael Barbaro and his show, and Sabrina Taverniersi, their show, The Daily.
sure,
So our job is to do what we've always done, but also to make sure that we reach the broadest audience that we can. And
yeah.
that's what we've done, with our website, with our visual reporting, um, our video work, our audio work. And what was your second question was about Trump?
Yeah, I mean, there he is. I mean, it's just this terrible fact of the matter, elected or unelected. I have a good friend on the West Coast who used to be my
Yeah.
entertainment attorney when I made four shitty Hollywood movies as the director back in the 80s. But he and I have remained friends. And he sent me a very poignant, he's about my age, and he sent me a very poignant little note the other day saying, I had really hoped that as I got older and my life began to head towards its conclusion, that when I died, I would go thinking we're on the right track, that my
Hmm.
son Henry would be in a country that's on the right track. And he says, I'm beginning to wonder if that's the case. And Frank is not given to that kind of statement. It really was
Um,
wrenching to me because, I have children and grandchildren, and my interest is not how am I going to live the rest of my life in this mess. It's like, what can I do in the last 30 seconds of my life to point to a direction which leaves them in some hope that it isn't all, algorithmically generated hate all the way down
I
for the
know.
rest of, I mean, it's just
Well,
mind-boggling. And the idea that
I
Trump is out there, I just feel so threatened by this.
I worry about that too. You know, I worry about our culture. I was interviewing a bioethicist, a very well-known bioethicist, Art Kaplan, recently for my book.
Hmm.
And we talked about the way forward. What is the way forward from this partisanship that is really bad for Americans' health?
Yeah.
And what should quote unquote public health do, or what should science do?
Hmm.
And he said to me, "You're not going to fix that unless we fix the culture."
Yeah.
And I think he's right. We're not going to fix that unless people can start talking to each other again,
Yeah.
unless our political conversations are not about who has what nickname for, their opposing candidate. And that frankly worries me because that's a really hard task to knit back together an angry society. And I don't know
Yeah.
what the way forward. I don't want to sound despairing. And I worry too. And one thing we haven't talked about, frankly, is climate. I really worry about
Yeah. Yeah.
leaving my kids and possibly, if I ever have them, grandchildren, a world that is burning up, that we've
Yeah. Burning up.
destroyed. And it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of cooperation to do the kinds of things that we would need to do to save the planet, to make our environment healthier. And
Yeah.
I guess I worry that, to borrow the phrase from my AIDS activist, Peter Staley, that, right now people are all about tearing down. They're not
Yeah.
about building up. And I'm sorry, I feel like I'm not really giving you a very good answer or a very
Yeah.
comforting answer. Um,
But I have a question that I want to throw in here. I'm not one of these moral of equivalency people that, oh, the left, the right. Trump is the enemy of freedom and democracy and free speech, period. Okay, having said that, and also the enemy of any change on climate policy. I mean, the avowed enemy, sitting down with oil magnates, making deals, give me money so that I can remove what little regulation there is. I mean, that's his MO. But it seems to me, again, having come out of a more friendly era where a friend of mine like Jack Kemp could sit down with his counterparts on the other side of the aisle and literally invite them home for dinner when he was a congressman and running with Bob Dole. You know, I remember those times, even when I was on that partisan right wing side. Um, do you have an opinion as someone with kids who are more liberal than you are about some of the, it seems to me, things that happen on the left in terms of liberal opinion that has simply done nothing except stir the pot and hand our heads on a platter?
I worry about that too. I do. I think I worry about a society that exists on the extremes, whatever extreme, whatever side you're on.
Yeah,
That there are people on the left who are as intransigent as people on the right. And I don't want to get into moral equivalence
sure, me neither.
either. I'm not this is not there are very good people on both sides.
No, me neither.
That is not
Right,
what I think.
right.
Um, but I do worry about the politics of extremes. And I give you an example. It used to be that there were a lot of competitive House seats, but now there are maybe, I don't know how many, 30. It used to be when I was covering Congress, maybe 40 competitive districts. And the reason for that is that everything was getting decided in the primaries. But
Hmm.
when everything gets decided in the primary, because you've got either a Republican district, or a Democratic district, and that's how they're
Sure.
gerrymandered, it pushes our politics to the extremes. So what you see now, when I first started covering Congress in 2002, you had a lot of people in the middle. I covered the Senate. You had Arlen Specter, a centrist
Sure.
Republican. Susan Collins was there, a centrist. Lisa Murkowski. There were other. I'm trying to remember who they were, but there was a serious centrist bloc,
Yeah.
and our because our primaries are controlling everything, and we're electing people at the extremes, and
Hmm.
there's no middle, and that's why nothing gets done.
Yeah.
Um, so, I think that it is not good for society for us to be in a tug of war where everybody's at the extremes, there's no cooperation. And I don't know how you fix that.
Yeah. And
Maybe
of
it's
course,
a
again, the
dated
way,
notion.
yeah, and the way we're communicating via, clicks on sites,
Right.
people looking at your phone doesn't lend itself to any kind of reasoned discourse anyway. I mean, you're into 10-second.
Yeah. And that's why Joe Biden has a hard time,
Yeah,
frankly,
exactly.
because that he is of the culture that you describe, which is a culture where, you know, Jack Kemp could invite, a Democrat,
Sure.
home for dinner and they could, talk to one another.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, on In
Biden
Conversation with,
famously,
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, Biden famously went down to, I think, the McConnell Institute in Kentucky and talked at, Mitch McConnell's institute, and a lot of liberals hold that against him.
Yeah, and I get feedback when I have somebody quote too far to the right for whoever my audience is saying, why would you have someone like that on? And my response is always because I'd like to know what they think.
Yeah.
I mean, what's your problem? I Ernie came up with a good motto for us, and that is no fanatics. That's our only guideline. We'll talk
No.
to anybody, but no, please, no fanatics. So let me ask you a
I'm sure I'll
question.
get in trouble for something I've said here. So
You won't get in trouble with me. And if
not with
somebody,
you.
you know, and well, someone will say something, but they always do. On the other hand, there's a lot of people out there, who are not into clickbait, who are relieved when they run into someone who actually wants to talk to people and find out what they think. So let me ask you a question. No idea on the timeline on your book?
My deadline is not until next year, until
That's
2025.
okay. Well, God
So,
help us. We'll see if we're still
so,
around.
well, I'm sure you'll still be around.
Yeah.
So I really, this is my first book. I don't know. How long does it take to get a book published once
Not
you
your
turn
first
manuscript
writing.
in? Not my first rodeo. It's my first
No,
book.
not your first rodeo, not your first hoedown.
No,
To go back to your story. Come back when you have your book. Tell us when it's ready
I will.
and let us do an interview with you and make sure that I'm looped in as one of your early readers,
Oh, I would love
either
that.
as a friend who will give you my 10 cents worth, which I would be happy to do when there's still things that can be done because I have a lot of books out there, and then and or just as a reader of an advanced copy to help promote it, whatever
I
comes to
would,
mind.
I would love that.
I
Thank you
would
so
love to do
much.
that. Please do. And then the other thing is, I have a request, and that is we're always looking for people to talk to we might not have thought of.
Okay, I'm going to give you two people right now. My
Okay.
colleagues Lisa Lehrer and Elizabeth Dias, who just have come out with a book called The Fall of Roe.
Oh, do me a favor. When we click off here,
Mhm.
please talk to Ernie for a few seconds after I'm gone
I will.
and give Ernie those names. Is
I
she Jim
will.
Lair? Is she related to Jim Lair at all?
No, it's Lerer.
Oh, okay.
And
Because
Elizabeth
speaking of
Dias.
good journalists who were in the middle, Jim was
Yeah,
someone who I became quite friendly with because he had me
yeah.
do commentaries for his show sometimes.
But I think they would be great for
Give
you.
Ernie the names and do us a favor and help Ernie get to them and say, Frank will ask you some good questions because we really want to go here. We want to follow up on it.
Oh, also, Katie Rogers, my other colleague, Katie Rogers, who just wrote a book called American Woman about the
Oh,
first
we would do
ladies.
that in a heartbeat. Is it out?
It's out.
Not a year from now.
No,
No.
no, no. These are all books. Well,
Instant
these are all books
gratification.
that are out, and one more New York Times colleague, Carlos Lozada, has written the Washington book,
Hmm.
and it's kind of like we read Washington books, so you don't have to. And
I'd
it's a
love to do all of
collection
those.
of
So
essays.
stay on for a few seconds with Ernie
I
and help
will.
us get in touch with them because we are looking for people to talk to on these subjects.
Okay.
So that would be very appreciated. And stay in touch with me on how your book's going.
Okay, I will. And
I'm really so interested in it. And if there's anything else I can do, in term, I know you've done the writing, but anyway, I would love to just stay in the loop on that
well,
because it
I
sounds,
I would really appreciate that. So I
yeah,
will.
no, it's a book I want to read. I look forward to it.
Thank you so much. I really
So,
appreciate it.
Cheryl, this has been a real pleasure. I look
Me
forward to
too.
reading your book and let me know if I can do anything that would be helpful for anything. Just let me know.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you so much for your time.
Okay, bye-bye.
Goodbye.